All right, 1 second here. All right, so welcome on to this Q&A. Again, I want to welcome to this Q&A. Someone wanted me to comment on a video. There was a short video somebody made, and basically there was a Chabad rabbi with somebody that had treated the last Lubavitcher Rebbe when he was sick, when he had a stroke, and the person that treated him was a neurologist, and one of the things they did to see what was going on brain capacity wise was to do a CAT scan, right, and see what's going on the inside, and he was already very old, right, at this point. So what they expected to see, again, this is a neurologist for years, so it's not a fly by night, type of person. And this is, someone obviously knows what he's doing. So basically said that when they check the brain, normally someone much older, the brain capacity, the brain itself shrinks. Right? And that's usually what happens. Brain capacity is less when they're older. Now, it doesn't mean a person can't be with it, can't be sharp, even in their 90s, or older. But at the end of the day, usually what happens is the brain shrinks. Now, it doesn't mean the person's going to have Alzheimer's or dementia or whatever. But what does it mean? What it means their brain capacity be less, probably remember less, so to speak. Again, everyone's different, but he was saying that the majority of people, when they hit a certain age, when they're older, when they're whatever, when they're much older, so their brain shrinks. Right? That's what he was saying. The brain normally shrinks. So in this CAT scan, they saw this neurologist, whatever, when I was working on it with a number of colleagues, and they're all shocked, right? What did they see? They saw that the brain was functioning. So first of all, it didn't shrink. That was the first thing. And second of all, functioned or seemed to have the functioning capability of someone much younger, much, much younger. Now, everyone knows Bob Schreiber is an absolute genius. I mean, no question. No question about it. One of the Torah giants of the last generation. So his brain, this neurologist claimed, was larger than most his age, right? For sure. And they said there's only one person now. I don't know if there's been, such a study done, after people died. Certainly not by Jews. You don't do autopsies, but that's discussion for another time. But the only person, I guess if they did an autopsy, that their brain, hadn't shrunk and was extremely big, like a younger person, like a much younger person. The only person they found, like, again, I don't know if they did a study. I don't know people they did this with, whatever the person was claiming. I mean, he's a neurologist, so he probably should know. I mean, I would think he would know. But in any case, he claimed the only person that had that type of brain capacity at that age, and that the brain was so big, it hadn't shrunk, was none other than Albert Einstein. Yeah. So you want to say that basically, I mean, everyone knows, Einstein was a genius also. Nonetheless, he himself, um, also his brain capacity was very strong, even at the end of his life, right? Even when he was, much older, right? So now the question is that one thing you see is that one thing you can see from this is that someone spends the years, years and years, like, studying and working on their, character development. The brain should stay stronger. One of the things I saw a study done years ago that the more a person wastes time, let's say watching TV, movies, and other things, it limits brain capacity. Yeah, not only limits it, right, but there was a study done, I think in the 90s. I think in the 90s when I saw it, it's not a proof. Again, it's not a full proof here, right? But this study said that the more a person wastes their time, watching movies and entertainment and sports and all these other things, they waste their time doing that, there's a very good chance. There's a very good chance the brain atrophies. And not only the brain atrophies, it can lead to dementia and Alzheimer's. Now again, that 100% proven? I can say it's 100% proven. It was a study that was done. That was the conclusion. Now that would make sense because the brain needs stimulation. Now, if you don't stimulate the brain, the person's not thinking or using, or just, wasting time. So the brain capacity can be less. Doesn't mean they won't function. Right? Definitely doesn't mean they won't function. Right? But at the same time, at the same time, it's going to be less. Right? It's going to, because the brain is not, stimulated, like it should be. Now, there is one question. There is one question on this. I didn't get a chance to look, but one question is: there were many great rabbis at the end of their lives. Their end of their lives had Alzheimer's, or dementia, or Alzheimer's. I mean, number of great people, which I don't understand that level, that level of brain power, that they had. I mean, we don't know. Nobody knows where it causes Alzheimer's, but what we do know is when it hits a certain point, there's no turning back, right? Once, if dementia is already, somewhat of a chance, you can try and contain it or whatever. Once it gets further, a person's mind or their brain is like Swiss cheese, it's impossible to bring back, right? Seemingly, science has not figured that out, right, in order to bring it back. Anyway, but you have great rabbis at the end of their lives had dementia, or they had Alzheimer's. Now, what about their brain capacity? Yeah, we could ask about their brain capacity. Now, if they would have done a CAT scan, just butchered that. If they would have done a CAT scan, right? Let's say, what should they have found out? What's most likely they would have found out? They probably would have found out that even though the brain was like Swiss cheese, the brain itself probably didn't shrink. Yeah, most likely. Most likely because the brain capacity. See, this is what happens when a person learns, and that's really why actually I want to get into this, because when a person learns, however much a day, it doesn't matter, right? But if a person stimulates the brain, through learning, especially learning Torah, because you never stop learning, and there's always what to know and what to learn and whatever. It's only so much the brain can take in. You have to keep reviewing, and all that. But what should happen is that the brain, and generally, this neurologist said, usually the capacity of a person at the end of their life, their brain shrinks. Their brain shrinks. Now, if a person spends, years and years learning for hours on end, again, if you would take them in, let's say they hit 85, right? They're relatively healthy. Okay. Do a brain scan. If they're using their brain capacity a lot, then I would say, in theory, without knowing anything, the brain shouldn't shrink. Shouldn't shrink. Or maybe shrink a little bit. Yeah. But the more the brain is stimulated, yeah, the brain should function, even if a person's older, like a much younger person. Yeah. And again, the reason is because you're feeding the brain material that's keeping the brain occupied. And it's making the person, it's making the person think. I'll give an example. I'll give an example. I was learning something this morning, and they're like, whatever, very, very subtle differences and how to look at a particular point. And there were two sides. There were basically two sides how to look at this point, but within those two sides, there were different ways of understanding even these two sides. Right? There were fundamental differences. Right? Fundamental differences, how to look at it even within the whole thing. So I was sitting there going through it, my mind like basically exploding, exploding in the middle because again, these are like picayune details, right? But the ramifications, the ramifications are huge, right? And so, in such a case where the case is this person under these circumstances, what they did or what was said, are they considered at this point, are they married or not married? Right? In other words, is this woman sanctified to him or not? Right now, it's a major difference. That's a major difference. Why? Because if she's considered really sanctified to him, and let's say, another guy comes along and sanctifies this woman, right? So the guy has to give the first woman a get, has to give her a bill of divorce. Major ramifications. Major ramifications. Whatever, a lot of different cases. I'm talking one specific case here. It doesn't really matter. It doesn't really matter what the case is. But the point is the ramifications are huge. Yeah, in other words, is she considered like someone who she is considered married, or she's not considered married, and what is it dependent on? So it's dependent on a few different things. Dependent on a few different things. But when you look at the inner workings of what's really going on, there are fundamental differences between some of the commentators. They may agree on X point, very good, but the way they get to it and how they learn it and other things are different. I mean, I haven't gotten to the end yet, but whatever, just going through this, you're trying to keep everything in your head, trying to, okay, I guess this one says like this, this one says like that, right? So you can make a chart, where they disagree, what the ramifications are, but you got to keep everything, you got to try and keep all these different points, in your head, which is not so easy, right? Not so easy. Well, for argument's sake, not so easy. Now imagine, okay, you analyze it, you understood it, more or less. You put, each side and what they disagree in, or what they may agree in, what the ramifications are. They get a whole picture. You get a whole picture. Now, once you have a whole picture, you spend, let's say you spend 20 minutes, half an hour, probably longer, right? It's probably a little longer than that. But, let's say going through this, I'd exhaust everything, so whatever, a certain way of doing it, but it doesn't matter. So at the end of the day, let's say after an hour, like after an hour and 15 minutes, okay, you got a picture, right? You got a picture, but what does this do? It makes you tired, right? So, but you have to keep the information in your head. Now imagine if somebody's doing that on a regular basis, day in and day out for years. Yeah. Whether a person learns an hour a day, half an hour a day, whatever it is that a person learns, right? You don't learn in general, it applies to men and women, doesn't really matter. A person does not learn in order that I'm just reading through information. Right? You can't, you can't learn like you're reading a newspaper. Right? You gotta think. You gotta think what's being said. You got to analyze what's being said. What are the ramifications? Are there ramifications? Again, there's a lot of picayune detail. Most women probably would not necessarily enjoy that because they just want to know brass tacks. What do I have to do? Okay. Yeah, for men, it's all about it's thinking here, thinking all these different ramifications, et cetera, and how they apply or they don't apply or whatever. Very good. So I would assume here. And I don't think it's a leap of faith there. I would assume that the more a person does this, the more the brain gets strengthened. Right? In other words, a person could waste time doing other things, okay. But if a lot of time is spent day in and day out, year, week after week, month after month, year after year, what should happen, unless there's any trauma or brain injuries or whatever, what should happen is that brain capacity should be strong, even if they're much older. That's what should happen. Right? Now, could that person, lose their mind and get dementia, Alzheimer's? Could. Very well could. I mean, I guarantee if you took a scan, my Rebbe's brain is almost 100. It'll be 100 in 2 or 3 months. Yeah, I mean, his brain capacity is still there. People call him, people ask him questions. His brain capacity is there. His body might be weak. Okay. See if we ever make it that we make it to 100. What'll happen to us if we make it? But even so, I guarantee if you were to take a scan of his brain's not going to be. It's not going to shrink. He's almost 100. Right? Now, why is that? Because all the time you put in learning. Now again, the question could be, now that's what should, sorry, let's say better. That's what should happen. Now, what about you take somebody, that's unbelievable knowledge, let's say unbelievable Torah knowledge, and at the end of the ride, they get Alzheimer's. Yeah? Now, their mind is like Swiss cheese, God forbid. And that can happen to anybody. Nobody knows why. Nobody knows, how it happens in general. But the question would be, if they've been doing this for years and years, spending hours and hours a day learning, then the assumption should be, depending on the brain capacity, that even if they're much older, the brain shouldn't shrink. Shouldn't shrink. Right? But again, what's the reason? Because they're using they're utilizing their brain capacity. And I saw a study done years ago also, or someone made a statement, I remember, and that is we maximize about 3% of our brains. 3%. Right? It's not a very high percentage, that we maximize. But a person who sits and learns hours and hours, analyzing, day after day, week after week. People think, they don't want to give any credit or any credibility to people sit and learn. Even if someone's going to go work afterwards, they're going to have to learn other things, whatever it is. Their brain capacity in general will be much greater than most people, even if they went to, the best universities or whatever. Why? Because they're taught from a young age how to think, right? Or not even how to think, but even to think out of the box, so to speak. So they're taught for years how to scrutinize, how to analyze, how to see differences between, 2, 3, 5 different people that seemingly say the same thing, on the same text, except there are few nuances. One left out this word, one put in this word, right? So he's had this whole thing, like, okay, he said everything the same, but he added this word, or he added this letter. Why? In other words, why just quote it verbatim? So it must be adding something. Must trying to be telling us something, So it makes a person think, right? So when they go into the workforce, they have to be trained in doing whatever they need to do. Like everything else, I'm not going to say, people are, actuaries and doctors and lawyers or whatever. Throw everyone under the bus. I'm not going to throw everyone under the bus, right? But people who sit and learn for good, chunks of hours a day, kids learning until, 25, 26, 27, whatever. They decide to do something, let's say they decide to do something else, let's say something in the secular world. Okay, so they have to get proper training. Very good. Right? So they need proper training. Okay. Yeah, but the way they've been trained from such a young age to analyze, they come with much greater credentials than other people have taken all these other classes. Yeah, what's the reason? Because they sit there for hours. One of my rabbis, bless him memory, I mentioned this before, was involved in inventing plastic bottles, like, decades ago, many, many decades ago. And whatever, happened to be a genius, in Torah as well, as in science as well. And he told me that, they didn't sit down and figure out a problem, like figure out, certain things. They had like He has all, scientists there, whatever. And he said every 5 minutes, 10 minutes, 15 minutes, they had to get up, they had to get a drink, they had to, smoke a cigarette, they had to take a 5 minute break, etc. Not that they had ADHD. Why they have to do that? Because they couldn't sit for so long. He said from a young age, he sit for hours. He sit for hours analyzing these things. So for him, it wasn't a big deal. Okay, this didn't work. You try this, that didn't work. You try, okay, so you rip everything up. You start from scratch. What do you know? What don't you know? What's the formula? Different things, whatever, whatever it is. And sometimes it's not so clear cut, right? Sometimes actually you got to think out of the box. And I remember a number of times, someone makes a statement and you're like, why guy's an idiot. No, you're not dealing with an idiot. Made a statement. He made the statement. Why did he make the statement? Yeah, so you got to think. I'm not giving it to you on a platter. But someone makes X statement, you got to analyze. You got to cut it up and say, okay, why did he say it? What did he mean by saying it? And what if he said something and then he said something else right after contradicting it? Does it mean that he changed his mind? Do we go after what he first said? Yeah, you got to think. You got to think. Well, what's going on? Brass tacks. But what does that do, though? In general, what does that do? It stimulates the brain. Yeah, that will stimulate the brain. And if you don't do that, and you waste time, and you waste thousands of hours, people's brains are mush. I'm not going to say they shrunk, even if they're young. I'm not going to go that far, per se. But this study that was done said, they want to conclude, that the more a person does that, the more the brain atrophies. Now that makes sense because you're a couch potato. You don't think. You're being spoon-fed ideas. You're not thinking. And the more you do that, what happens? What happens the more you do it? The brain capacity goes down. That's what should happen. Yeah, but the more you stimulate it with things that it's making you think, that should stimulate the brain. So I would assume, again, without knowing anything, but I would assume the more a person does that, the more the brain's stimulated. The more the brain's stimulated, even if a person's older, even if a person's much older, that brain capacity should be the same as someone who's younger. Yeah, that brain should not shrink. Why? Because the brain's always being fed. It's always being fed with new ideas. So one of our rabbis, Wilson, once told me he was learning by somebody learned together with him. He learned with him all together 14 years, but learned, the study partner for 7 years. For 7 years, the person, absolute genius. Absolute genius. He said, I'll tell you what the novelty is. The novelty is he can look at a text. He can look at a text and he knows what everyone says. He knows what Rashi says. He knows what the Rambam says. He knows what the Code of Jewish Law says, right? He knows what all the commentaries say, right? So he's got an idea already. I mean, a very big idea, exactly which way this is going to go. Yeah, he said his genius was he could look at something he's seen 100 times. He's seen 1,000 times. And he can look at it like he's seen it for the first time. That's greatness. Why? Because the person can say, okay, I already know this. I already know what Rashi says. I already know what the Rambam says. He still looked at it like he never saw it, right? So, yeah, probably a much harder thing. Much harder thing to do. If a person, doesn't review properly, and every time they see something, it's like the first time they see it, okay, that's a different issue, right? But if someone's seen it so many times, yeah, so many times over and over and over again, they know which direction it's going, they know. Yeah, so, yeah, you can ask, where's the enjoyment in that, whatever, okay, that's a different issue, but how do you look at something? This is what he said. This is what this rabbi of mine said. He said, how can you look at something that you already know, you already gone through it 1,000 times, you already know all the ins and outs about it, and look at it like it's the first time you ever saw it. Yeah. But again, what does that do, though? First of all, you don't rely on your memory, right? So, you still got to go through things. Yeah. Well, the second thing is, well, what does it do? It still stimulates the brain, right? That's what it does, right? So again, I would say that if someone's doing that on a regular basis, what's going to happen? Their ability to analyze goes to the charts. Will go off the chart. Why would go off the charts? Because that's what they've been trained to do, since they were very young. Secular world doesn't give it any credit. They don't give it any credit. They say, it's a waste of time, whatever they're doing. But there are plenty of people who've come out, plenty of people that have gone to the workforce, been successful, and their employers are like, many are dumbfounded, in a certain way because, of what they're capable of doing, and they don't have a normal background like most people. They didn't go through the system like most people, in the secular world. Okay, so maybe they had to be trained and other things, whatever, very good, right? But they should have a keen awareness, of how to look at things, and how to analyze, and they do see at the system they're brought up in, it's something that's very powerful. That's the reason, one of the main reasons, that Koreans decided to translate the Talmud into Korean because they see, Jews are at the top in all these like different fields, so it must be learning Talmud makes them smarter. Yeah, so I don't know exactly how to translate it, whatever. Let's say the proper, translation. It's not just about, academic learning, that's part of it, right? Obviously about character traits and other things, but they understand, Jews are 1/1000th or less of the world's population. When you look at Nobel Prizes, science, math, and other things, the Jews are like exponentially up there. It doesn't make it, doesn't make any sense, right? And now, the reason is not because of how they're brought up, right? Because a lot of these people are secular, right? So therefore, if they don't, if they're not brought up religious, they don't become religious, right? Let's say, so they have to put their effort, their brain capacity, something else. And Jews are very much in education, right? Very much in education. Now, a lot of Jews in the wrong education. Okay, but a lot of Jews, into education. So they want their kids to be doctors, doctors, lawyers, and whatever, accountants, whatever. So they put all that effort not going into Torah, right? Totally not going into Torah, going into other fields. They become experts in these fields. But again, it's part of the DNA because it doesn't make sense logically, right? We're such a small percentage, of the world. Yeah, and we're the head of high tech and so many different things. So in this case, now the question is, if you had like a great rabbinic scholar, and there've been a number of great rabbinic scholars who unfortunately, towards the end of their lives, they end up getting dementia and Alzheimer's for who knows what reason. Yeah, the question would be if you check their brains, as they start to decline. Yeah, as they started to decline. Yeah, not that full blown out Alzheimer's or whatever. What should show before that is that brain capacity is very strong. Should be very strong, and it should show that the brain doesn't shrink, right? Even at an advanced stage. Again, what's the reason? So again, this neurologist said, what's the reason? He said, okay, the Bavjar have to be an absolute genius. Very good. So you have rabbinic scholars that are geniuses, no question. Right? Absolutely no question. Right? So that should follow suit. Now it depends what level of genius. Yeah, bigger ones, less ones, whatever. But that should be the case. But it's interesting, he said, the only person, now again, I don't know if they did a study or not. Some of like the most brilliant people, whoever they are, or however they gauge that, that if they did a CAT scan towards the end of their lives, or right after they died, right, let's say, wouldn't show the same thing. So he claims the only one that's ever shown, that the brain didn't shrink at that advanced stage was Albert Einstein. That was it. Right? So no one else had that capacity. Yeah. Or whatever. Just an interesting, just an interesting thing. But again, it would make sense, it would make sense if a person's using their brain capacity, right? Their brain capacity to the utmost. If they're using it to the utmost, then I understand. Yeah, then a lot of people at the end of their lives, yeah, when they're much older, their brain capacity should be like someone younger because they're maximizing, or surpassing the brain capacity that most people use. And that makes sense because you're working on all these different things for years. A person's learning and there's stimulation. That stimulation will continue. It's never going to end. Right? The Gemara doesn't change. The commentaries on the Gemara don't change. Right? We have the early commentators, later commentators, whatever. They don't change. Right? They don't change. So it's trying to get the information, but it's trying to understand. Understand the capacity of what they're saying. So you do that on a regular basis for years. That's what should happen, in theory. Right? That the brain also should not atrophy. Should not atrophy because that's the main focus. Yeah. So again, someone gets, I don't have an explanation. Someone gets, dementia, Alzheimer's. We don't know where it comes from. They don't really know. Right. And when it gets to a certain point, they can't stop it. Right. They certainly can't stop it. But, and that's a tragedy. That for sure is, that's a tragedy. But you have someone with like so much knowledge. Why should that happen to them at the end of their life? Don't know. No. All that's gone. All that's gone. It's a sad thing to see. You see someone like, such a stature in there. Fortunately, the mind's not there, so to speak. But it does make sense that the less you use the mind, the less you stimulate, it can turn to mush, right? So we can do that. Yeah. So that's what I want to say on that. Somebody says, okay. A bunch of questions here. Someone says, or someone saying there's a type of fear called yiras hara, a fear of evil, right? Fear of evil, not a good thing, right? What's fear of evil, right? What is fear of evil? Well, there are different levels of fear. We mentioned before, lowest level of fear is a person's afraid if they do something wrong, I'm going to fry in hell forever. That's the lowest level of fear. A very high level of fear. Very high level of fear is what? Is what we call Yerusis Romans. Just spoke about this the other day, right? It's fear of God's awesomeness and what God does in the universe. Yeah, and looking at the human body and looking at nature and all that, right? You see there's a world of design, as Abraham saw at the age of 3, the age of 40, or older. He saw there's a world of design. That's awesomeness, right? See what God does at a much higher level. Much higher level. Someone here says there's such a type of fear called fear of evil. Yeah? Fear of evil. Well, definitely not a good thing. Yeah? A person, can get scared enough, not for this generation, but a person can get scared enough where they're going to be careful every little thing they do, which we all should be. Yeah, we all should be. A person will walk in the streets and their eyes will be down. They may like bump into things here and there, but why are their eyes down? They don't want to see anything. They don't want to see any image they shouldn't see. What are they afraid of? The image goes in and it affects them. So they're very careful what they see. There's plenty good to be said about that. Because images we see stay with us. 100%, they stay with us. Right? So people have a fear. People have fear of seeing things. Yeah? There's some people will not look at a computer. Yeah? Will not look at a screen. Why not? They have fear. And it's a well-founded fear. Because even though, we spoke about this before, I don't want to harp on this, right? But, even though there's a lot of Torah, there's a lot of Torah on the internet, like that's no question, and, people come back, to Judaism, sometimes based on what they see, and different videos and different classes or whatever. There is what to be said for that. If they're going to be on it anyway, good. So you have good things out there. The vast majority of stuff out there either it's forbidden or it's a total waste of time, right? Most of it's forbidden. Most of it's probably forbidden. Now, some things you probably tell me, not so bad. I want to check the news. I want to check the weather. I want to, order this online. Okay, there are things that do have a benefit. Things that do have a benefit. The problem is you're not there for 5 minutes. That's the problem. That's the problem. You look up something, and then either something pops up, or you say, "Oh, maybe let me look at this, look at that." Next thing you know, an hour went by, or half an hour went by, or whatever. So that just takes away from what we need to do. So if a person, always on certain things, they can't get on anything else, good, right? So then they're super focused. Okay, and if not, you can, your mind can stray, and all kinds of different things. They may not be forbidden. 100%, no forbidden images. Maybe it's not lashon hara, let's say, whatever. Okay, but you have to say, you say that everyone find out what's going on in the world. What's going on in the world? Like a friend of mine would say, if there's a war, I'll find out about it. Yeah, you have two extremes. One is people have nothing to do with it; they don't have anything to do with it. It doesn't benefit them. They don't benefit. Right? Other people say there is benefit to it. They, try and minimize certain things or whatever, but there are two schools here. Yeah, on either extreme. But again, I'm not talking about to say things that are totally forbidden. That's another issue, right? That's a whole other issue, but it has an effect. It's an addictive thing. It's a totally addictive thing. I heard someone, they took on they made a Kabbalah. They took on something before Yom Kippur. What are they going to take on for the year? So normally we say you take on something small, then you cut it in half, and then you cut it in a quarter. You take on something you can do. That you can do on a daily basis, something very, very small. So his thing for this generation, you'll get, I mentioned it before, but we'll mention it again. It's not something huge. Definitely not something huge. The person may say, come on, that's nothing. Yeah, what was it? So he said, before he goes to pray in the morning, he's not going to check his email. You're going to say, well, that's a tiny thing. Maybe. For this generation, person gets up, they want to see what's going on in the world, to see anyone send them an email, whatever, before they go pray. Doesn't mean they're going to be on for 10, 20 minutes, half an hour. Doesn't mean that. Doesn't mean that at all. Right? But they just want to see, they don't want to send them anything, whatever. For this generation, that's a big thing. That's a big thing because, it's such a desire. It's such a desire. And the bigger thing, in the bigger scheme of things, you're like, come on, not checking your email before you go pray. What's the big deal? But, you want to see what's going on. Anyone send me anything, you're expecting something, whatever. Yeah, someone says from Rabbi Mizrahi, fear of the categories. Fear of punishment, yeah, that's lowest level. Fear of his Romamus, right? God's awesomeness, right? Right. That is, that's true. But it's again, if you're gonna tell me, people have, fear of evil, yeah, they don't want to go near it. It's like if they go near it in any way, shape, or form, what are they, what are they afraid of? It's gonna have an effect. Right, so they won't go near. It's like touching, it's like touching fire. Anyone want to play with fire? There are pyromaniacs out there, But someone knows this is dangerous and this could potentially kill you. You won't touch it. Yeah, but we don't. When it comes to certain things, internet a good example. We don't see it that way. So it's not going to kill me. It's not going to affect me. Not true. Definitely not true. Someone asks, "It's true that two souls can be reincarnated into one human body?" No, that's not true. One soul can try and take over another body when another soul is in it. It's called the dibuk, which we've spoken about, where this soul does not get, for whatever reason, it does not get its judgment, and it's running away from these angels of destruction. So the soul tries to get into another body. Yeah. So there are times where you can have two souls together, yeah, in one body where one soul's not supposed to be there. Right? So You get great rabbis, Kabbalists, whatever, get the soul out, right? Souls are not supposed to be there. You don't have, in general, you only have one soul in the body. You don't have two, right? Even if they're reincarnated souls, which most likely we're all reincarnated souls, but it doesn't matter. Yeah, even if a person wasn't a reincarnated soul, yeah, you don't have two souls in one body. The only case where you never have two souls in one body is this case of a dibuk. This case of a dibuk where the soul tries to goes into another body, and it's not supposed to be there, right? So they bring these great, Kabbalists and rabbis, whatever, to get the soul out, right? Because in Christian literature they call it exorcism, yeah, but it's not a demon; it's another soul in the that gets in the body. So within Judaism, right? I'll just mention this for a second. Within Judaism, throughout the last thousands of years, only be a handful of cases. There's only been a handful of cases where you had another soul and another soul, in another body, where there was already a soul there. Yeah, there's only a handful of cases. Not common. It's extremely not common. It can happen. Not saying it can't happen. Yeah, but it's extremely not common. Right? Not very common. But in general, a body will never have two souls. It only have two souls when another soul goes in, but it shouldn't be there. But the soul jumps in the body. How's it get in? I don't know. But somehow this soul gets in the body as well. But it's very uncommon. Extremely uncommon. But to make a statement and say that two souls can be reincarnated in one body, not true. That's definitely not true. Somebody asked any thoughts on three-eye Atlas, other objects floating around our solar system? No, I don't have any thoughts. I'll say that a lot of times we do hear, we do hear about impending doom from, let's say, asteroids, that are potentially going to crash into the earth, or meteors, right? Or meteors, let's say, going to destroy, that are going to destroy, what do you call it? Going to destroy the earth, a collision on earth. Okay. Yeah. The collision on Earth, and then it sort of gets knocked out or whatever. So, every so often you hear about these things. Do we take any stock in it? I don't know. Scientists might. I don't think we take too much. I mean, if it's meant to be, it's going to cause all this damage. Okay. Will it? I don't know. Hasn't happened yet. A lot of times they make these predictions and they say, this is going to happen. Usually something happens before they hit the Earth's atmosphere, or even if they hit the Earth's atmosphere and nothing happens, let's say nothing happens, or either nothing happens, and it hits somewhere in the middle of nowhere. So it doesn't really do that much, it doesn't really do any damage. Right. But yeah, you haven't heard, I mean, forever that any of these things, whether asteroids, meteors, or whatever, even if they're in a direct collision course, with Earth that could cause unbelievable damage, obviously it hasn't happened, right? I mean, anything's possible. I'm not saying it can't happen, right? But I don't think most people, even if they hear about it, even if they would hear about it, and how many people are gonna I mean, it's nothing really to do anyway. I mean, unless it's gonna hit within a certain area where you are, and you can go somewhere else potentially, but nobody's doing that. No one's doing that. It's interesting. These things could happen, but most times they don't happen. Or if they do happen, or if they do hit, they're much smaller and they do minimal damage, if anything. Right? If anything. Someone asked, I heard of a case of Dibuk in our time. No. I did hear of a case though. I did hear of a case. When was it? When was it? 70s, 60s? I don't know, it was a while ago. It was a while ago. I did it every case, but not recently. Not in the last, I don't know, 60, 70 years probably. Probably it's very rare. But I remember I heard something, but I don't remember exactly when this was. Could have been the 50s, could have been the 60s. I don't remember. I don't remember. But I mean, in the 70s, 80s, 90s, and till present day, I haven't heard such a thing. Um, I've heard from Rabbi two parties can share one soul and they can marry each other in life. Okay. Yeah, not my area of expertise, but I would think not that way. Um, um, I don't even know how that would be possible. Could be, according to Kabbalah, maybe it's possible. I don't know. I don't know, but who cares? Yeah, you heard such a thing. Does it matter? Is it relevant? What's it relevant to? Not relevant to anything. Interesting. Okay. Yeah, no, it's not, it's not practical. Not really relevant to many things. Is it forbidden to waste time? And if so, what's it called? um, person needs to chill. Person will say, I need to chill. Yeah, how are you supposed to chill? That's permissible. Person wants to read. Yeah, again, for a woman, it's a lot easier because a woman doesn't have an obligation to learn Torah. Yeah, like a guy does. But let's say, even for a guy who wants to chill, he's allowed to look at the news. Yeah, isn't that a waste of time? It's a waste of time. But he wants to chill. He can't, he's not going to learn. He's not going to learn. Well, do something productive, right? Going to a ball game, that'd be a waste of time. Yeah, that's probably or watching, right? Would be a waste of time. Now, in that case, would I say that certain things better than others? Okay, if there are no problems of modesty and language and all that, and the biggest thing you say, well, he could have been learning Torah and he didn't, and they're involved in that. There are worse things. There are definitely worse things. Problem is it can be addictive. That's the problem, right? Is reading fiction a problem? Some people when back in the day when Harry Potter came out, before the movies, the books came out. So, it's all about sorcery, even though again it's fiction. The people like this type of stuff. Okay. Well, some people say you shouldn't read it because, you get into sorcery and other things, and therefore a person might, want to do that, as well. Other people said it's fiction, it's fiction, it's no big deal. Just because it's sorcery doesn't mean it's forbidden, right? It doesn't mean it's forbidden. Watching movies. Again, you have a lot of problems, as we said before. You got immorality, you got language, you got violence, I mean, plenty of things. Right? So again, let's say you don't have any of these problems, even with the G movie, let's say, but you still have problems there also. But let's say, so that's a waste of time. But we're not going to learn anyway at that point. This guy's not going to learn that part. Okay. So what are we not going to learn? Anything, you have to look at it like this. Right? Very general statement we'll say is, whatever a person's going to do, even if it's a waste of time, the person has to ask themselves the question. If what I'm doing right now, is this going to help me in my service to God or not? That's the question. That is the $1,000,000 question. Is it going to help me or not help me? Now, some people will convince themselves, wrongly, but they'll convince themselves and say, that this is good for me. But they're lying. It's not good for them. They'll say once in a while. Now, that has to be checked. It can be more than once in a while. Yeah. So people are going to have ups and downs in these types of things. But I have to ask myself, is this good for me or not good for me? Is it good for my service to God or it's not? Now, if you're honest, you'll say, this isn't good for me. Now, if someone's reading a book in fiction, this one, and there are no problems reading the book. Okay. They'll say for that, it's good for me, relaxes them. Okay. Yeah, there are worse things a person can do. no question, right? So the issue is, in spiritual terms, is this good for my soul? In spiritual terms. Now, wasting the time to waste time because you just want to waste time, you know, even if a person's not going to learn. I understand, we're not machines, but, we try and maximize as much as we can do. But what if a person knows they're not going to learn now anyway? They're not going to learn now anyway. So want to see what's going on in the world. Is that the worst thing? It's not the worst thing. Again, if you didn't have watching our issues or, other images or whatever. So not the worst thing, right? Not the worst thing. Is it beneficial? You know, I would tell you like this, on a daily basis, if a person wants to do this, I wouldn't tell people to do it, but if someone wanted to do it, check out the news headlines for 5 minutes, less than 5 minutes a day. Yeah, it doesn't matter when. Doesn't matter when. You write down, take notes, on what was going on, what were the main things that day, and do it the next day. Do it after a week. Do it out now. After a month, go look at what you wrote. Did the news change that much? Now, there's some things you'll tell me significant. Significant things they found out about, they're happy they found out about. Okay. But if you look at the vast majority of things, same thing, different day, right? Not much different. So you got a month in, 2 weeks in, something like that. It's the same, right? It doesn't change that much. Wars here, threats here, terrorist attack there. It's the same. Doesn't change that much. What about listening to music? Someone wants to chill and listen to music. Okay. Depends what type of music. If it's a guy, can't listen to a woman sing. You want to listen to elevator music, dentist music, like you're about to get drilled by a dentist, right? Soft music, and do that, help you relax. Sure. Not a problem. I wouldn't say it's a problem. If the person, doing, who wrote the music or whatever is a rabid anti-Semite, that might be a different issue. But person wants to listen to music to relax. Person wants to go outside, someone else listens to birds sing. Okay. You want to see God's creation. Okay. That wouldn't be a waste of time. That's seeing God's creation. That'd be a good thing. It's good for people, also. They have certain hobbies, keeps them busy. People like to garden. Yeah. Probably not in the winter, but unless you live in a place that, it's warm all year round. But let's say someone likes to garden. Is that a bad thing? Not a bad thing. Yeah. It's good to have hobbies, I think. I think most people that don't have hobbies go crazy. They don't know what to do with themselves. So that's why God created sports. Well, people get into sports and entertainment. Yeah. That's the biggest waste of time. And these things make billions. Billions. It's unbelievable how much money they make. I see someone hit a ball or see someone acting or whatever. In a movie, it's a big business. Totally big business. Doing things to see God's creation, that's a good thing. 100% is a good thing. Victor Miller used to, just to walk every night, probably for health reasons also, but used to walk in the park, see the greatness of God's creation. Right? So you had to walk anyway, very good. So the person has to exercise, you can listen to classes. You can't listen to class, you don't have that, brain capacity, your mind's too tired. Okay, you want to listen to music, whatever. You can do that. But again, it's got to be, obviously, it's got to be kosher music. If the woman wants to hear another woman sing, that's not a problem. Again, what are the lyrics, though? It should be Jewish music. The whole question is exactly what Jewish music is. That's not topic here. A lot of Jewish music is copied from non-Jews. Just they use kosher words. They use, verses from the Torah, verses from Tanakh. Whatever. That's not so simple. That should be forbidden to do. It should be for people do it. People do it. It's clear people do it. The question is, are they allowed to? So you see, there's permissibility to do it. Not so simple. It's really not so simple, but in general, it can be done. So you go see inspiring music. Okay. That inspires the person. Very good. Person sees nature. Very good. But there are plenty of other things that a person can do. Like I said, with the news and entertainment, and sports, and other things that are a total waste of time, absolute waste of time. Yeah, it doesn't make a person better. But on the other hand, it could be a lot worse. These things on the weekends where people go to ball games and watch these things or whatever. It keeps non-Jews from hurting Jews. They're busy with all this stuff. Still plenty of anti-Semitism. I'm not saying no, but look what it does. Look what it does. It keeps people off the streets. Yeah. Definitely keeps them off the streets. They could be doing worse things, a lot worse things. So it does have a purpose, but of course, should we be doing it or watching or following it or whatever? Someone asks, I heard from Rabbi, the last generation before Mashiach, there will be no Torah giants anymore. Are we going to be punished for not knowing Torah enough and doing mistakes? It's not going to be Torah giants. We have Torah giants now. We're in the last generation before the Messiah comes. What does it mean? Everyone's going to go backwards? No one's going to know anything? People are just going to have a 25 IQ? I don't think that's true. You're going to have Torah giants even in the last generation. Yeah, they may not know exactly what to do, what to tell people. Doesn't mean they're not Torah giants. Right? Take someone like Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai. Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai lived the time of the destruction, right? And he was able to escape and see one of the heads of Rome was going to be the head of Rome, and he asked for three things. One, to save Rabbi Tzadok, who was fasting for 40 years before the destruction, to save his life. Right, the line of the exarch, Rabbi Gamliel, save their family. Right, and there's one other thing. Yeah, so the rabbis ask, why didn't he say don't destroy the temple in Jerusalem? Yeah, he could have said that. So why didn't he say that? Right, so the Gemara says God turned his brain backwards. That's one reason. In other words, he didn't see it. Why didn't he see it? He was Torah giant in that generation. Because God didn't want him to see it. And he probably would have thought also, if I asked to save the temple from being destroyed, it's not going to help. So, I'm not going to ask for that. But they asked the question. Same thing. A similar thing during the Holocaust. There were many, many rabbis who told people not to leave. Other people told people to leave, to flee. A lot of rabbis didn't tell people to leave, and then they got stuck. Then they realized they made a mistake. But what happened? God made them not see what they need to see. That doesn't mean they're not Torah giants. Don't make that mistake. There were many, many Torah giants that generation got wiped out. Much greater than rabbis today, no question. But what happened? God made their mind go backwards. He didn't allow them to see what they needed to see. Why? Because God made the decree. He made a decree this was going to happen. But there were some rabbis that did see it, and they did tell people to escape. Very good, but obviously not enough. Doesn't mean there won't be rabbis, there won't be, Torah giants in the generation before the Messiah comes, right? I definitely don't think that's true. I definitely think there will be. There definitely will be. I mean, obviously not compared to previous generations, but there will be Torah giants in every generation, right? Now, could be, they may not be able to give the best advice because they don't know what to do, in certain situations and what's going on. Okay, that doesn't mean they're not Torah giant. That means just God's not allowing them to give them the brain capacity in order to see what they need to see. That's a different issue. That's a totally different issue. Yeah, it doesn't mean they're not Torah giants. That doesn't mean that. All right, let me see other questions here. Somebody asked, is it true before Mashiach comes, Islam will take over the world? Islam's going to have a lot of power. It has a lot of power now. It has a lot of power. Take over the world? Seemingly, there's going to be a battle between Islam and Christianity. Right? Edom against Ishmael. Right? That's what the Malbim says. More than 100 years ago, he says in the prophecy about Gog and Magog, he said it's going to be a bloodbath between Edom and Ishmael, the Western world, against Islam, and major bloodbath. They're going to say, why are we fighting? It's because of Israel. They join together, try and destroy Jewish people, march towards Jerusalem, and then the Messiah comes. Right? So are they going to be dominant, have world power? They'll have power. They definitely have power. I mean, their goal, obviously, is to take over the world. They're not going to do that. Right? They're not they're going to try and dominate. They definitely going to try and dominate. Right? They're going to be pushed back, certainly by the Western world. That's what we see now, trying to push back, so to speak. But they are definitely going to try and dominate. Now, are they going to take over? It doesn't seem like they're going to take over before Messiah comes. They're going to try and dominate, yeah, but if you hold like the Malbim, what the Malbim says, it's going to be a clash. It's going to be a battle for power, yeah, and that battle of power is going to be between the Western world and Islam. That's what you see now. That's exactly what you see now. But Islam going to take over? Doesn't seem like it. They'll have power. They definitely have power. There are plenty of countries where the Muslims are a small minority, but there are places in these countries the police will not go in. They will not venture into these places. Yeah, different neighborhoods and different things. France, England, or Germany, other places. I mean, they have power. Yeah, I'm not taking over. Not yet. Right? But there'll be major clashes. Major clashes. Yeah, so they'll be offset by the powers that be, by the Western world. Yeah, are they going to defeat the Western world before the Messiah comes? I doubt it. Very much doubt it. Someone says, someone here says a Tibetan philosopher monk who legend says the liberator became two souls upon bodily death. Okay. Yeah. Kabbalistically, can that happen? I don't know. I'm not a Kabbalist. I didn't play one on TV, so I can't say. I can't say. But normally, two bodies should not be able to take over. Two bodies should not have one soul. In both. From the little that I know, and you can take that with a grain of salt, but it does not seem to me that is the case. I mean, this person was a Tibetan philosopher monk. Legend says it became two souls. Okay, legend says. Who cares? I don't believe anything legend says. Show me. It's true or not true. Yeah. Same thing. Christianity. Prove it or don't prove it. Right. JC said everything was supposed that he did was supposed to happen. Never happened. Never happened. Yeah. Many things that the Messiah is supposed to do, he didn't fulfill. According to them, he did. Okay, but we hold he didn't fulfill them. So, yeah. So, talk is cheap. He could say it. He had two souls in his body. Okay. And, I take that, put it on a piece of paper, and throw it in the garbage. What's it worth? I don't believe what legend says. Prove it. You don't have proof, then who cares? It doesn't really matter. But according to Kabbalah, from what I understand, that should not be the case. It should not be the case. But again, anyone's going to prove anything. Prove it. Legend says it. Okay. We also have a legend about the famous golem of Prague. Some people say it's true. Some people say it's not true. Okay. That there was a golem created. Okay. Practically speaking, has no relevance. Doesn't have any relevance. Interesting. Definitely interesting. Right? But again, practically speaking, it doesn't really have that much relevance. Anyway, even if the legend, so what? That doesn't mean anything for us. Doesn't show anything. Any other questions? All right, I'm gonna stop here. I do this every Tuesday and Thursday, 10 o'clock Eastern Time, 5 o'clock Israel time. Anyone has any questions, feel free. You can find me on Facebook at Michael Kaufman, Beyond Orthodox Conversion Judaism, orthodoxconversion.com, Beyond Orthodox Conversion Judaism on YouTube. There I got videos, Q&As, ethics about fathers. Local Leviticus, you want to send me an email, rabbichaimkaufman@gmail.com, RBBICHAIMCOFFMAN @gmail.com.